The paper that I'm presenting at the Dutch Accounting Research Conference today is about segment reporting. And so segment reporting has always been a very controversial area within financial reporting because on the one hand we see that capital providers like investors really care a lot about disaggregated reporting. And so they care about understanding where profitability comes from and better risk assessment of the different operations of a firm. But at the same time we see that the same information is also very important for competitors, and they can take advantage of seeing where firms are performing well and potentially changing their strategies to take advantage of this information. So there's a tension between providing information to investors on the one hand, and on the other hand that firms say it puts them at a competitive disadvantage. Now the tricky issue here is that firms could also just be saying that these disclosures put them at this disadvantage because they could also be using it as an excuse to hide poor performance, for instance, that they don't want their investors to know about. And so you see that a lot of firms say that they suffer competitive disadvantages, but we don't really have a lot of evidence for this. And so when we look at the research in accounting, there's not a lot of empirical evidence to support that this is really a concern. And so the paper that I'm presenting, which I co-authored with Arnd Verriest from edX Business School, is exactly about this topic. And what we try to understand is whether segment disclosures of geographic areas are potentially influenced by these proprietary concerns. And the neat thing is that we can use a setting where a new standard was introduced that forced firms to reveal more information about geographic locations and how they're performing. And this allows us to identify what information was hidden before this standard was introduced. And then we want to see whether the information that is hidden, whether that can be linked to proprietary cost concerns. And the way that we do that is by looking at where these segments are located and looking at whether they're located in areas that are more attractive for business, that have lower entry barriers, that have better future economic prospects, and so on. And so what we find indeed in this paper is that all of these factors that affect the performance of segments, that this also affects the non-disclosure of these segments. And so firms are more reluctant to provide this information out of competitive concerns. And in addition to that, we find that once these segments are revealed, firms are also more likely to hide some of the information about these segments. So they're less likely to report profit numbers for segments that used to be hidden. And they also just disclose less information in general about these segments. We know from prior literature that segment information, and particularly geographic segment information, is important for understanding these risks and the sources of profitability. And what practitioners should know is that all of this information can be affected by a large number of factors. So it's not just that the standard setter says you need to disclose this information and that firms are just going to blindly follow that, but that they also have incentives to even when a standard forces you to reveal something, that they might still have some incentives when there's discretion to hold things back. And so there could be very good reasons to do that, but it's good for practitioners to be aware of that, and also for standard setters themselves, understanding the trade-offs between informing investors and informing competitors, which might be potentially damaging, is important for them to take into account when they're setting new standards.